Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the controversial panel. Um, I, as the evil archdemon war dictator, have the unfortunate constitutional restriction that I'm going to stick to asking questions and not answering them. Uh, but, did I hear a boo? Well, too bad. These wonderful people are going to be answering the questions. So the goal is to try to kind of get into some of the issues that people like kind of blabbing about on whether it's on Reddit or on Twitter, and try to kind of get some different perspectives on these, but also particularly from some people that don't normally kind of tends to speak on these things too loudly, right? So I guess maybe to start off, how about we all introduce ourselves?
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Anthony Sassano. I'm co-founder of ETHub. It's a community information hub for Ethereum.
Hi, I'm Remington. I'm a founding partner at Fenbushi Capital. We're first Asian blockchain fund, first Asian VC fund focused on blockchain.
Hi, my name is Obi. I'm the founder of NodeTokyo, which is like first tech-focused blockchain conference in Japan. Also, I'm the co-organizer of the Ethereum Japan meetup.
Hey, I'm Michael Elliot, and I'm a blockchain engineer at MakerDAO.
Hey, everybody. I'm Albert, currently focused on helping the Ethereum Foundation.
Hi, I'm Karl, and I work on Plasma Group, and I'm a blockchain enthusiast.
All right, so first question to whoever wants to answer. Should ETH have a supply cap? Go, Karl.
Yes. No. Not entirely sure. I think that the supply should be, I like maybe having a cultural norm around some kind of reasonable inflation or fixed supply, just like as long as it's somewhat stable, maybe. Like stability is something that I'm into. It's something that I'm into. I like stability.
I think, obviously, that question implies how would you actually reach the cap. I'm genuinely just curious the different ways people can think of that you would, whether asymptotically or other ways, hit such a cap.
Yeah, I don't really have an opinion on this, to be honest.
Me neither.
Unpopular opinion, no. If you're thinking sort of in the span of the next 1,000 years, nobody can really kind of predict where this will go, when more supply will be needed, and when sort of people think that a $100,000 ETH will be way too expensive, just psychologically. So I think that with the right governance system and the right sort of way to collect opinions, there should be flexibility in the cap.
Yeah, I would say probably not to a cap. We're seeing the pains of a cap kind of happen in the Bitcoin community, especially where they're arguing about are fees going to be enough to cover the lack of block rewards when the block rewards become insufficient. Obviously, the Bitcoin block reward halves every 4 years. There's no real solution for that. In the Bitcoin community, I think they're trying to push everyone to layer 2 and make layer 1 this kind of global settlement layer where the fees are high, so they compensate the miners. I'm not sure if that's going to work. It's probably too early to tell, but I wouldn't want to put a cap on Ethereum for now, because I think once we do that, it'd be a lot harder to remove the cap if we found out that it wasn't the right way to go about it.
Okay, so next question in a somewhat different direction. The Ethereum community has this culture where it, for example, heavily emphasizes developers and developerness, right? So our main annual conference is called DevCon. Here we are sitting at EdCon, the Community Ethereum Developer Conference. We have hackathons, and there's also a tendency to kind of look down on making events that focus more on things like price speculation, for example. Now, not everyone is a developer, and there's plenty of people that are just not interested in writing a line of code, but they're also enthusiasts. They're really excited about Ethereum. They're excited about finding ways to help Ethereum. So how should we reach out to these people, and what should someone in this position do in the Ethereum community, and how do we welcome them more?
I guess I'll take that because that's what we're doing with ETHub. That's literally one of the core reasons we started ETHub, is because we felt there was this big group of people that were underrepresented in the community. Not to say that devs are properly represented either, I don't think. One of our goals for ETHub is to eventually have a developer section as well, because we feel that they don't have anywhere to go besides like GitHub and the research forums and things like that. There's not really great developer documentation in a central place for Ethereum, unfortunately. But in terms of like the kind of, I guess you could call them investors and stakeholders in the ecosystem who are passionate about Ethereum in the community and also like speculate on its value and have ETH as an investment, I think that they deserve a voice as well. As much as, you know, that side of things can get out of control, especially as we saw in 2017 with all the ICO mess, you know, and all the money being thrown around and the kind of, I guess you could call it disgusting things that were happening. I think the community members who take the kind of investor stakeholder side of things aren't those types of people. I think they deeply care about Ethereum and its values. They just come at it a different way, as they're not developers, basically.
So first of all, I fall strictly into that latter camp. I'm not a dev, but very enthusiastic. I think that sort of two ways to approach that. First is I think that focusing on developers right now is kind of right because we're still, as a tech, it's still at its infancy, but at the same time, there needs to be a way to communicate to sort of non-devs about the core values, about sort of what ETH is trying to achieve in a non-technical way. So talking about sort of ways to decentralize, to build this community governance and things like that. There needs to be ways to communicate this in sort of plain English, whether it's YouTube videos or sort of just interest articles or something like that. I think that on a communication perspective there, that could be improved. I think the other level is once we get to the level where sort of dApps get more robust and more interesting, then that, I think the interest will be self-organizing as well. I think that once sort of there are a bunch of dApps, then you could imagine like a game conference, like gaming dApp conference, or like a finance dApp conference, or DeFi conference, or something like that. That's kind of focused on actual end use cases and not so much on the developer side. So once that more matures, I think that will kind of self-organize. But at this stage, it's quite important to communicate the values to sort of non-dev people as well.
I'm not a developer either, but the reason why I first got interested in Ethereum is through people. When I was at the venture capital firm, we were the first investor for Omise, even before they became a blockchain organization. So I got interested in Ethereum through Jun Hasegawa, who is the founder of Omise. And you know, I really like Jun, so I wanted to look deeper on what he's working on. And also, got to know like Aya Miyaguchi, who became the executive director of Ethereum Foundation as well. So I really like Aya as a person and her vision. So that's how I first got really attracted to this community. So I think for non-developers, I think it's pretty important for like non-developers like Aya or Jin to talk more about what Ethereum is working on. And also for like non-English countries like Japan, I think like a lot of materials or resources is translated into the language is very important. So I think like Aya Miyaguchi is like a perfect person because she can speak in Japanese. Also, she's not a developer, but she can talk with the non-developers about like what's Ethereum about.
Yeah, I think there are plenty of different roles and skill sets that can add value to the ecosystem beyond just developers. So like different challenges like UI and UX that are being worked on, different approaches to using dApps and remove the friction that's involved as one example. And a lot of different startups as well that can take advantage of this sort of, the power of decentralization and permissionless finance, like money remittance, and yeah, like entrepreneurs that wanted to get involved and take advantage of these like the interoperability of blockchain and what that allows people to do through permissionless integrations. So I think there's a lot of different types of people that can really add value to Ethereum and blockchains in general.
So I think that the trade-off here is, like, it's easy to say that you want more people, more types of people involved in any community. Like, of course we want that. And the challenge that anything that grows has is, like, at first you are, if not explicitly, you're implicitly selecting for certain types of people, and that's part of the draw for those people. And I think that, you know, Ethereum's focus on Ethereum's just vibe of being developer-centric and also being, like, kind of, I don't say forward-thinking, but, you know, open-minded in terms of how you go about, like, building in a blockchain context. That formed a lot of the kernel of the initial community, and I'm obviously not against seeing Ethereum, you know, be more welcoming to all other types of archetypes. I would argue, though, that, like, it actually has been quite welcoming, and it's evidenced by the fact that there is not a, you can always use more, but I don't think there's, like, a massive shortage necessarily of some of these other archetypes. And I do, like, just to try to take a little bit of a different view than what's been expressed so far, I think we should be cautious about how much you try to push in different directions. Like, implicitly, this developer focus is kind of like a shelling fence, meaning, like, it's not so much people are strictly against any particular type of person being more involved or more business conferences or whatever. You're trying to protect against the slippery slope that follows, and that's something that we should be considerate of. I'm actually going to throw out kind of like a bit of a, I don't know if this is going to be a hot take or something sort of in that direction, but I would actually argue that Ethereum is not as developer friendly as we think it is. In particular, I think it attracts certain archetypes within the developer community very well, but I don't actually think that it necessarily, for instance, cultivates an environment for, like, I'll even take an example since Vitalik and Karl are on this panel. Like, ETH research is amazing. I don't think people would argue against that. But ETH research is actually not, like, the best environment for certain types of researchers who have other kind of styles for how they like to present. There are people who, for better or for worse, really prefer to present much more polished work before they engage with a broader community. And you might say, well, get used to it. Like, in Ethereum, that's not how things work. But, and I'm just pointing out that as an example, I don't think we should skip straight to assuming that Ethereum is, like, amazing and perfect for developers or researchers of all shapes and sizes either. And that is something we should also be keeping in mind in addition to the broader question that you asked.
Yeah, that was great. So now I definitely agree that we should expand the number of developers and the different types of developers. That was a super great point. But with regards to, like, non-developer people, I think that a meme that may be somewhat effective is that there is this, like, fear of large companies, and they're, you know, they have all of our data, and there's, you know, so much centralization, and oh my gosh, the future. And I just feel like that kind of sentiment is something that I felt for a long time, and that kind of drew me to decentralized tech. And I imagine that peer-to-peer technology wouldn't be as well funded because of these, like, centralizing interests. And so maybe the broader, you know, population is now more receptive to those things, and I think that we have some cool alternatives, but we'll see.
So the Ethereum community often prides itself on being kind of non-maximalist and even anti-maximalist, and trying hard to distinguish itself from, say, crazy hyper-Bitcoinization trolls on Twitter that say that literally every other coin is, including the US dollar, is a shitcoin. Now, on the other, there's clearly good things about this, but on the other hand, there have been concerns recently that by kind of taking this attitude, we're letting other and potentially kind of zero-sum competitive projects essentially walk over the Ethereum community. What would a healthy Ethereum community attitude to non-Ethereum projects, and particularly even non-Ethereum community smart contract projects, look like?
Okay. Oh, sorry. I don't think there's a great answer for this sort of stuff. It's kind of hard to gauge where a lot of people are at with this thing, because I think the Ethereum community is very nice, very very welcoming to a certain set of people. But when you say community, it's such an ambiguous term. There is so many different people with so many different views on things that kind of form their own little cliques around things, and they're at odds with each other. So you have pockets of people disagreeing, and then you have people that don't know each other, but people who do know each other disagreeing with each other. And then you know, there's competitors that come in and they're friends with the people in the Ethereum community. You know, I don't know how many people in EOS and Tron are friends, but people like from Parity that are working on Polkadot are definitely friends with the Ethereum people. And then you see it play out on Twitter, you know, and Reddit. All these conspiracy theories start happening about people trying to poach developers and things like that. You know, just to get a bit controversial there. So yeah, I'm not sure how we kind of solve that. I think the Ethereum community, whenever this gets brought up, the kind of antibodies, I like to call them, kick in, and they reject this behavior. But it does push people away, and I think there will be people who leave the community and the ecosystem for, I guess, what they perceive as greener pastures on the other side. But I think eventually all, I guess, blockchains reach a size where they become very high stakes, and there's infighting regardless of how much you try to prevent it.
So I don't think that we're at a point when it's a zero-sum game yet. I think that, I mean, right now the focus should be on growing the pie. This community, as large as it is already, is still tiny in the sort of scope of the whole world. So sort of, we shouldn't be at a stage where we're AOL versus CompuServe fighting over the same 1 million users. We should be growing the internet to the next 2 billion users. And I think, sort of to paraphrase something that I guess you said before, that, I mean, when you take it in the context that Ethereum started with, quote unquote, like 100% market share, the only way to go is down. And sort of, if you only focus on sort of that market share part, sure, it doesn't look great that sort of people are moving out from Ethereum to other communities. But at the same time, if you're sort of building a more inclusive kind of ecosystem with all the different blockchains and people kind of developing in different directions, then you have the potential to attract a broader kind of crypto blockchain community. And this community, again, it's hard to define that, but sort of there's still a lot of demographics that we haven't reached yet. I mean, there's a lot of talk about like decentralized governance, for example, but if you think about it, right now it's a lot of tech people, a lot of devs that are arguing over governance. We haven't actually invited like political scientists or people who have actually studied governance all their lives into this discussion yet. So there's still sort of so much of the community to kind of reach out to that we shouldn't be quibbling over sort of a few developers that are going from one chain to another at this stage.
Yeah, so I've been mostly like being an observer of like you know, recent discussions going on Twitter, Reddit, and as I said, I'm like fascinated with the people, not exactly with like each project or something. So when I co-hosted a big Ethereum meetup exactly a year ago, when Vitalik, Albert, Karl, and all of the core developer came to Tokyo, I got a chance to hang out with Gavin Wood. And then he came out around 10 p.m. for dinner, and he's saying like he's been coding all the night, all day in a hotel without eating anything. And then I was like, God, really like make me like admire him, you know, his passion and focus. So I'm like definitely interested in what he's working on, and hopefully I can help too. And then so yeah, I mean, I think that essentially the vision that everyone's working for, and then also like a reason that, you know, people working very hard is like somewhat similar. So I want kind of like make Japan is like Switzerland for like a blockchain diplomacy. So and everyone just come to Tokyo and then, you know, hang out together for karaoke or good sushi and make it a good bond.
Perth is also a really great place to check out if you're looking for blockchain development. This guy gets it. Yeah, so I think I personally love the Ethereum community and a lot of the values and principles that it represents and that the community holds. And I think there's still a lot of innovation going on. And so this like a maximalist approach is never really healthy. It's always good to kind of at least be receptive to the opinions of and research being done by other projects, and a lot of research that can be shared between different projects. Yeah, but I think in terms of collaboration between different projects, that's always great, and there's still a long way to go, I think, in terms of development and research. And it's just, yeah, it's going to be exciting to see where things are in a year from now.
I'm less concerned about like the particular question of what the policy should be. What I'm more concerned about is a couple of things. One is I think that like the Ethereum community can improve at really seeing past the surface level of what a lot of people, you know, say. I think that like the phrase that actions speak louder than words, it's something that you have to grapple with, because on mediums like Twitter and Reddit, you don't really have a chance to do anything other than talk. It's not even to say that because you're on Twitter, I mean, multiple people here are frequently on Twitter. It's not saying, you know, that means you're not also acting, but it's tricky. And so I'm more concerned about like, can the Ethereum community kind of, you know, continue to evolve its thoughtfulness around the dialogue and even the intentions of the people involved in certain dialogue. And along like, you know, a similar lines, I would say that like if you consider just the future direction, it's easy to say, hey, you know, there's so much work left to be done. There's a positive sum games left to be played, and all of those kinds of things. But making sure that we recognize I guess like the principle, here's actually a good way to put it. So Vitalik, you pointed out on Twitter, like, you know, there's people who were soldiers or did horrible things, maybe in like war crimes, other stuff, and probably actually if you met like many of them and had tea with them, you would think that they were a pretty reasonable person. The Ethereum community, in certain slices of the Ethereum community, are pretty small and insular. It was actually very surprising to me as I got more involved. I was mostly an outsider for the first couple of years and then got more involved. And I was pretty amazed at how frequently you just see the same small subset of people, and you get to know each other through those events, and it's great. It's been, you know, really a huge pleasure for me personally. But it also, I think, creates this like risky bias where, yeah, you hang out with people, so we all tend to assume better of people that we spend more time around, unless we end up having a really bad experience with them. So I think it's like concepts like this that I'm actually more worried about, is just, are these like implicit biases with the way that we've interacted with each other and with the way the community is in some ways smaller than it might appear at times, at least in certain circles. How is that going to affect like the interactions and the thought process, and just evaluating the intentions of other people?
Are you saying like the risk of like an echo chamber existing?
Both an echo chamber, and it's like, it's just easy to think, if you're around someone, it's like, oh, this person's great, there's no way that like, you know, they have a bad intention here or something like that. And I would say 9 times out of 10, maybe even 49 times out of 50, that's correct. But be aware of the bias that can create, because we know that people at scale or in larger groups often operate very differently than people do individually. And I think this is like a tricky concept, but one is especially relevant in like a, you know, blockchain, decentralized, global context.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I'm supposed to ask questions, but like, what do you do if you identify someone who has a bad intention in some ways? I don't know.
Can you vote them out with ETH? Like, is signaling?
Yeah, I think that it's more just like, at the minimum, remembering that it's easy to say things. Let's at least start there with like, what is being said it's cheap, literally. I gave a presentation earlier and I was like, this is literally why like proof of work and like proof of stake like exist as like civil control mechanisms, because talk is literally that cheap otherwise. So just like at least keeping that in mind. I'm not trying to condone like, you know, being mean-spirited necessarily or things like that. There's a lot of stuff going on here, obviously, for any of people who've been following things lately. But also just like, let's like, there's a spectrum between like being mean and being like super naive. And I think we're still calibrating on that spectrum. And I think we're aware that we're calibrating on that spectrum. That will hopefully improve the recognition of such things.
Quickly, everyone, what is your favorite non-Ethereum ecosystem cryptocurrency project or blockchain?
Honestly, it's Bitcoin. I'm gonna just, and a favorite for both good and bad reasons, but I think that, for one thing, I think that like Bitcoin really paved the path in many ways, and Ethereum is able to operate as a community or ecosystem, whatever those words mean and how they represent people interested in Ethereum. Ethereum is able to operate in the way that it does, in part because Bitcoin cleared out a path and made that more possible. The like kind of joking metaphor story that I often tell is like, I feel like Bitcoin people had to like hack their way through this jungle, you know, with the machete and these like dangerous animals and snakes and everything. And you know, by the time they cut their way through the jungle, it was like, you kind of have PTSD, I feel like. You know, you're just like, everything you see, you're like, oh my God, I gotta swing the machete at this. You're like, no, chill, man, it's cool. I'm not here to to eat you. And then unfortunately, there are people that I think have exploited that and really encouraged that behavior. And it's kind of like, yeah, you're a side, like they're treating the Bitcoin, that aspect of Bitcoin as like a sideshow that's entertaining, which kind of encourages it. But I think like looking past certain unsavory or aspects of the Bitcoin community that I don't personally love, I think they cleared that path. I think that Ethereum was able to kind of walk more calmly through that path and therefore like take on different values and norms as a result of not having to fend off as many like jaguars and like, boa constrictors and stuff like that. And I think that's just worth keeping in mind and acknowledging while also not wanting to be, just like the Bitcoin community in a lot of ways.
Yeah, Bitcoin definitely paved the way for Ethereum, and that was my first introduction to cryptocurrency. It was the first blockchain. But yeah, I think what Ethereum has done with the development, I guess it's a more agile. There are more agile innovations being made, and it's a lot harder to make those with Bitcoin, given the current state of things. So all the people that kind of wanted to really push the envelope and innovate have come over to Ethereum, but a lot of the same values are from Bitcoin.
So I'm going to start with a few kind of per-person questions. Michael, so when the DAO was hacked in 2016, about 3.5 million ETH was taken by the DAO hacker, and this was a sufficient amount of money to cause a hard fork, which almost split the Ethereum.
I think you did the right thing, Vitalik.
Do you think?
Is that what you're asking?
Do you think MakerDAO currently holds 2 million ETH? Do you think it's a systemic risk to the Ethereum ecosystem?
I think it was interesting how it created this whole other community with Ethereum Classic that also allowed for innovation to happen. And now there's even collaboration between the Ethereum Classic community and Ethereum, which is great to see. What was the last part of the question? The
question is, given that MakerDAO has 2 million ETH in a smart contract, which is almost the same amount of money, do you think this is a systemic risk to Ethereum?
Was the DAO contract formally verified?
No.
Well, there you go. I mean, that's the problem right there. We formally verify all our contracts. It's like a really important part of the process. So I do feel like that gives us a lot of confidence to avoid black swans like that.
Okay. Albert.
Also, black swans are native to WA, and Perth's a really great city. Recommend you check it out.
Albert, what do you think are some of the kind of inefficiencies in how the Ethereum ecosystem funds just public goods, and what could the Ethereum Foundation do to mitigate this?
Yeah, I think that the Ethereum Foundation has probably over-calibrated towards just kind of doing work behind the scenes and maybe not communicating as proactively as would be optimal for the ecosystem. I think that if you think about what one of the roles the foundation can and probably should play is to be viewed as one of the fundamental allocators of resources, whether that's money, whether that's other kinds of signaling, whether that's forming connections, whether that's being like a more neutral shelling point for like other organizations to come together and do things. Right now, you don't really hear the EF talk about any of these things. You don't hear the EF talk about how it's going to hold itself accountable for whether it's doing these things. These are all things that the EF, as far as I'm aware, is aware of and is working on. But like, to state the obvious, if certain things aren't being communicated as much, it would be shocking if there weren't major coordination inefficiencies, awareness inefficiencies, prioritization inefficiencies, and so on. And not to say the EF should be setting priorities, don't get me wrong, but even just hearing the EF reason through its priorities will help others who both agree and disagree kind of figure out how they can complement it or even challenge that. And I think that would be better for the entire ecosystem.
So, Karl, what do you think about this idea that has been brought up recently of adding some kind of issuance that would point into either some DAO or some other mechanism that would fund Ethereum public goods?
It is definitely a scary proposition to tie yourself to a particular funding mechanism, considering it seems like every one of them that I'm aware of has a lot of problems. I think that there are interesting things that can be done because I do worry about public good funding, and I do worry that, like, we build this great decentralized financial infrastructure, and essentially all it does is it makes it, easy for money to get more money, basically. And that is a little scary because I'm definitely into, funding public goods and not having tragedy of the commons problems. So I heard some things like, it would be nice to have, for instance, an Ice Age, if you were to have issuance funding, to have an Ice Age for it, so it dies down over time. It's not a commitment of, 0.1% forever and ever, 0.01%, whatever. I'm on the fence. I think I would be cautious. I would say in a sentence, I'm cautious to do it for now until we have done more research on issuance and have better identity solutions for stuff like CLRs.
So Rem, and I know Fenbushi is closely connected to Wenxiang Blockchain Labs, which has done a lot of grants to Ethereum ecosystem projects, and particularly, it's helped fund Prismatic, some Casper state channels research. Do you think that other kind of well-funded ecosystem participants in Ethereum could do more to support public funding of ecosystem goods?
I think so. I mean, I think that whenever you want people to sort of pull money out of their wallets, I think that everybody will be thinking of some sort of return, whether it's sort of short-term return or long-term return. It's going to be a little bit different for everybody. But I think that's part of the reason, sort of going back into sort of being able to communicate the values and the vision and what you're trying to achieve to a broader audience. Why I think that's so important is because I think Wenxiang is one of the few kind of old school or large companies that kind of gets where this is going, and they can see kind of the long-term benefits of putting out these short-term grants to benefit the whole ecosystem, which in turn will kind of benefit what they're trying to achieve in the long term, which includes smart cities and creating sort of decentralized finance ecosystem in China and so forth. Not a lot of sort of older institutions with funding kind of get that at this stage. So I think that that message needs to be kind of distilled into a non-technical long-term kind of vision that more stakeholders can kind of buy into and therefore support these community projects more.
So Anthony, we've been seeing more interest recently in DAOs and DAO-like things to provide alternatives to the Ethereum Foundation for funding. So two of the biggest ones I'd highlight, there's MakerDAO, and then there's also this Gitcoin grant CLR, which is in the process of doing its second round right now. What role do you think these kind of DAO alternative projects can have, and particularly how can we support them, and what kind of an end game do you see for them?
Yeah, sure. So I do like the idea of Moloch and what they're doing, what Amin's doing with MakerDAO. I think it's a really great experiment to be having, kind of not on the base layer protocol, and it's not, it hasn't become like the DAO in 2016 yet because all the hype kind of isn't there at the moment for that. But it's a good time to launch something like that, to experiment with it. I think the team took the lessons from the original DAO and all the suggestions that should have been put into the original DAO and put it into Moloch. So that experiment seems to be going quite well. I'm a big fan of that. In terms of Gitcoin grants, I'm a big fan of that as well. They're doing really good work with the matching, trying to experiment with new funding mechanisms. and that's been really successful so far. Actually, ETHUB's funded partially through that as well. So. And a lot of the ETH2 teams are on there. There's a bunch of other teams on there, and the money's flowing. I think that's a good way to signal to people where to put their money, basically, and know that it's going to the right people. DAOs in general are just a tricky thing. It comes back to obviously how they're governed and things like that. I know from sitting in the protocol kind of funding Telegram group within the first couple of days, it just became a mess because no one could agree on who to give the funds to, whether it's a DAO or to give them to the EF or so on and so forth. I think the general consensus was that the EF are the most value aligned with Ethereum, so they should be the ones to manage the funds. But then people said that, well, let's do a DAO because the community can manage it. But I'm not sold on that type of thing at the protocol level just yet. I would like to see experiments like Moloch play out, and so we can learn all the valuable lessons from that. And if that blows up, then we know not to do it again.
Obi, what do you think about ProcPow?
Well, I don't have much opinion on that.
How do you think the community should decide things like ProcPow?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I want to make more and more non-English community to be involved with those governance discussion around Ethereum community. And there's actually a lot of super talented developers started working on Ethereum in Japan. And also, I think one unique thing about is that a lot of enterprises also started researching or working with Ethereum, because Ethereum Enterprise Alliance in Japan is also becoming active. Yeah, I would love to do anything that can help those connection with non-English community, not only in Japan, with those global community, which is mainly discussed in English. So what do you think would be the best channel or best way to do it?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, unfortunately, I'm forbidden from answering questions myself.
Okay. Maybe start from translating ESUP to Japanese. Yeah, that's what I talk about. Yeah.
So, one more and controversial topic that seems to be under discussed. ETH 1.x and particularly the state rent part of ETH 1.x, right? So. The technical background here is that back in December, there was this small tweak to Ethereum node software that just unexpectedly massively increased its efficiency from the point of view of propagation. So from a pure block propagation point of view, it seems to me safe to potentially raise the gas limit even as high as 40 million, which is a 5x increase from now. But on the other hand, state size is currently bottlenecked, and full node syncing is bottlenecked. And so there's a need for for the state size to actually, so the number of accounts and contracts and storage to actually go down. And LXA has been working on state rent proposals, which would basically require existing accounts and new accounts to constantly pay for storage that they control, and accounts that don't pay get removed. This would basically improve Ethereum sustainability and open the door for short-term, very significant scalability increases, but on the other, it would break a lot of existing applications. So question one, what do you think of this? And in general, what kinds of things should the community have in mind when making these kinds of decisions?
I think state rent is integral to the kind of continued sustainability of Ethereum in the long run. I think that's obvious from a technical perspective. I mean, it's controversial because it obviously will break a lot of apps. It'll be like, I guess, a tax, and you have to pay these fees. But I do imagine that dApps become big enough, such as MakerDAO, that CDP owners would just pay the fees themselves, right? They're not going to let the contracts expire or whatever it is, and the fees not be paid, because then they lose the access to their CDP or whatever. So there will be apps like that that get paid as like a public good sort of thing in terms of state rent, things like that. But all the ones that kind of, I guess, break and have to redeploy their contracts and everything, if they're important enough, I think that they'll get redeployed. There's obviously a lot of contracts on there that were just done, a lot of token contracts that were just done to make money, and no one really cares about them. So I guess it depends on the app, and it depends how much people care about the app. I can't imagine something like MakerDAO being left to rot unless no one was kind of using it. I do imagine that people would pay for it, even if it wasn't the devs themselves paying for it. And things like that. So I'm curious. I am watching ETH1.x and the state rent kind of proposals very closely. Alexi's doing great work there. I've seen on ETH Research there was a kind of trade-off depending on how you implement it. There's different attacks that can happen. There's different things that will break. So I don't know how controversial it will be. It depends what proposal we decide on in the end to go forward with, and how much breaks basically.
Yeah, I think a lot of what Anthony was saying, yeah, basically that, and the fact, I think it'd be good that it would incentivize smart contract developers to really clean up state after themselves. But there's, yeah, if you were to enforce it, looking backwards to existing contracts, that could break a lot of dApps currently, unless you were to like scan the blockchain for active dApps and reach out to them and list that no. Your dApp might break. So then maybe another solution could be only enforcing it for new dApps, and then as they would upgrade the contracts in the future, then it could take effect. But definitely as a way to reduce bloat and to enforce, like to encourage smart contract developers to clean up after themselves, clean up the state in the contracts. Yeah.
I think we understand, at least at a direct level, the trade-offs around it. I think that Ethereum 2 kind of helps make state rent perhaps more amenable, because we already know that there's going to be some sort of upgrade process necessary. We probably don't have enough time for this, but I'm curious, maybe even afterward, to hear, when do people think, when or if should Ethereum be actually immutable at some point? That's I think a valid thing. And is immutability actually what you need for trust minimization, or how much of an expectation of immutability do you need for trust minimization? Because I think a lot of this connects to that in some way, in terms of well, you have basically immutable code, except you do have a VM that changes. You do have a protocol layer that changes. Fortunately, Vitalik, you're not allowed to answer questions around this. I don't have to ask you, but yeah, I'd be curious if we have time, if anyone else has any thoughts on that, or we can chat more about it later.
Yeah, maybe Karl, you want to answer Albert's question?
I'm partly Buddhist, and I believe that not everything changes. There is no escaping. As much as we try, it's going to change. But I mean, it doesn't have to change a lot, and so our lifetime, maybe it doesn't change. Who knows? I think that change is. I think we definitely need to change to Ethereum 2.0. That will be a great change. And then after that, everything is a little less clear. And then with regards to state rent, I think it's really just up to the proposer of the state rent change to produce a compelling argument and do some really good, make a really good push for it. I think that there's probably enough incentive to have someone, champion that. I know that it is an important issue that needs to happen over time, but yeah, we'll see.
Rem, any thoughts on when should Ethereum become more immutable?
I agree that, so I think immutability, as I understand it, applies to the state, not to the code or the way that it functions, because I don't think that there is such thing as perfect software. I think that there's always going to be continued improvements. There's always going to be bugs. There's always going to be sort of adaptability to whether it's new technologies or whatever else comes in the future. So I don't think that the code and the way that it functions should be immutable. I think that change is inevitable. It's just kind of a matter of when and where and sort of how you decide when is the right time for it.
Obi, what do you know of any kind of position that would be that's popular in the Ethereum opinion that's popular in the Ethereum Japanese community that you think is either kind of very different from what we see in, say, in English language discourse, or even just any kind of big difference in emphasis?
I think like one big difference is like people don't really argue much.
Yay, Japan!
I mean, there's like a lot of users. You know, I think like all of the developers in Japan are pretty active on Twitter. I think Japanese people is like a number 2 biggest Twitter users next to English users. But yeah, I feel like different people working on even different stuff or different chains. Feels like people are like listening to each other and then yeah, and then trying to like collaborate or like trying to be like curious about why they're working on that or why they're interested in that technology. Yeah.
So last question for everyone, and go through it quickly because the timer's getting angry at us. Is Ethereum decentralized enough?
Do we know what decentralized means? Yeah, some parts of it, I guess, are decentralized. I think the fact that we can't come to a conclusion on many things shows that a lot of it is decentralized. We have a broad range of kind of opinions on things. Whenever something's brought up, we have for and against. I don't know, is the ability not to change something or not to push something through, such as prog power or to come to consensus on something, does that mean we're too decentralized? We can't come to a conclusion. We can't get things through. I'm not sure. It's an open question. I don't think we're ever really going to have an answer to it. There's a blog post I read kind of quantifying decentralization and the different aspects of it, like the decentralization of the developers, the nodes, miners, things like that. You have to kind of take a holistic view of things and see. I think Ethereum and Bitcoin are obviously the most decentralized systems out there that we have today, but it's very hard to quantify because you have central points of failure in kind of any system, I think. And people have their own opinions on this, how much influence the core devs have, as they have a lot of influence in things, I think, or how much influence does the investor community have, or the exchanges. A lot of people believe that it's the exchanges that actually have the last say because it depends on what fork they choose to go with will be what people trade, I guess, at the end of the day. So there's just a kind of holistic approach that I think we have to take to that to be able to answer that question.
I don't think it's very decentralized today, but I don't think it should be. I think that there are sort of right levels of decentralization for each stage of kind of development and maturity in the community. And I think sort of at this point when it's still evolving, when we're still sort of discussing 2.0 and who knows sort of when 3.0 will come in and so forth, there's always such a thing as too many cooks in the kitchen. So sort of it is kind of good that there is sort of some form of consensus and centralization right now in terms of decision making and so forth, which itself is already sort of going quite slowly with all the delays and everything. But if it was even more decentralized, then it would be even more delayed than it is already now. So I think that sort of it's at a right level of decentralization where it is now, but doesn't mean it shouldn't get more decentralized in the future.
Yeah, before answering that question, I'd like to put as like 2 points on my last question. So unique thing about Ethereum Japan communities, I think like a lot of developers working on Plasma. A lot of people like looking at Karl's video, and there's like another project called Plasma Chamber who will be speaking later tomorrow at the con. Also like a lot of developers working around CBC Casper, one of the developers just presented this morning. And back to like this question, and then I feel like, yeah, I pretty much agree what he said, and then I think like it's still very, very early stage to be like free decentralized. So I think like some sort of like a leadership or like around like building the community, especially around around the world, it's pretty good. It's pretty good for the whole Ethereum community, I think.
Yeah, I think some parts of it, like the way that clients access state, so currently through Web3 and in Fura, a lot of the time could definitely be improved. There are projects working on that, like Vulcanize, into ways for like maybe a light client in the browser that runs and can track state changes all the way back to the Genesis block, for example. Yeah, and these are things that are being developed, and we'll hopefully have a better way to a more decentralized way to have browsers interact with the blockchain in the future.
I think that true decentralization and like trust minimization is full stack, and that stack goes well beyond Ethereum. So if you look at like the internet itself or like hardware, I hope that regardless of exactly where Ethereum lands, it can help with the decentralization of those other parts of the stack as well.
Yeah, I think this is such a hard question. I think that we should centralize around good memes and try to be, push a narrative for humanity that we can all get behind, that does good things for people and, promotes good people and good actions, because that's good. So.
Yay, humanity first. Thank you.